So the ventricles sit in the brain like this. I want to show you the torso model and how it gets into the venous system. In order for us to get this fluid into the heart, it has to get into this part. So this is what's known as the internal jugular vein. So the internal jugular vein is what comes down, and that's what leads to get into the heart. So let's figure out, how does cerebrospinal fluid eventually drain into here? So this is where the choroid plexus is. So CSF is produced here, and then it's going to travel through the ventricle system. It travels through the ventricle system, and then it eventually gets to this part, which is what's known as the subarachnoid space. Once you get to the subarachnoid space, it then gets into these red dots. So these red dots, this is what's known as the arachnoid granulations. So looking at it from an anterior view, both of these are the lateral ventricles. This is the third ventricle, and then this here on the bottom, this is the fourth ventricle. This part here at the very bottom, this is what we know as the central canal. So the central canal is what travels all the way through the middle of the spinal cord. Okay, so how do we get from one ventricle to the next? So for this one, you have the inner ventricular foramina. From the third to the fourth, it travels through the cerebral aqueduct, and then it'll continue to flow until it gets to the lateral apertures. So these are the lateral apertures, and this is the median aperture. Some of the other particular regions, you have the anterior horns here in the front, the posterior horns on the back, and on here at the bottom, these are the inferior horns. And so if you remember what we talked about today, what lines the ventricles? What type of cells? The ependymal cells. Yeah, so the ependymal cells, that's what lines the ventricles where cerebrospinal fluid is circulating. Okay, so now we've identified this, we can refer back to our head model. So once again, it's coming down, and then it's getting through the subarachnoid space, into the arachnoid granulations, and into this particular part, which is what we know as the superior sagittal sinus. So it's traveling here in the superior sagittal sinus, and then it eventually leads to this particular region. So this is what's known as the confluence of sinuses. And so when we say the confluence of sinuses, so not only is CSF circulating through the superior sagittal sinus, it's also traveling through other particular regions. So if we look at here at the top where number 11 is, this is the inferior sagittal sinus because the superior is on top. So then this converges to this point, and then if I turn it this way, you can see this is where the straight sinus is. So CSF is coming through here, and then it reaches to this point, which is what I said earlier, the confluence of sinuses. So then once it gets to this point, it travels transverse. So it goes through the transverse sinus, which would be seen here, coming this way. And then from there, it goes into the sigmoid sinus. Once we reach the sigmoid sinus, which is shaped like an S, we then finally reach our final destination, which was the internal jugular vein.